This is a recording from the Congress to Campus conference held at Reading Bluecoat School on the 2nd of March 2015. The conference was sponsored by the Eccles Centre for American Studies at the British Library and the British Association for American Studies, with support from the US Embassy, London. This session is entitled Elections and Party Prospects, and the speaker is Professor Philip Davies, with discussion from former members of Congress Claudine Schneider and Dennis Hertel.
Ladies and gents, my name's Phil Davies, and Cara and I work at the British Library running the Eccles Centre for American Studies. I too, like Cara, discovered American Studies at university, though indeed decades before she did, since I'm an old guy. But I went to university to do maths. Indeed, I did a year of a maths degree, and I enjoyed it. I was pretty good at maths. And then I was at a university which gave the opportunity to try other subjects, and I went to an American Studies lecture. It was given by Professor David Keith Adams, a wonderful man with whom I'm still in touch. And it was on the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. And I thought, my goodness, topology, St. Valentine's Day Massacre, which of these do I want to do for a degree? No choice. But maths was a key interest, and one of the great things is that in doing American Studies, you can bend it a lot to your interests. And what I've ended up doing through most of my career is those aspects of the examination of American society that you can do through numbers, through numeracy, through elections, through population statistics, through evidence, strongly based, firmly based evidence. But even strongly based and firmly based evidence, when it comes to predicting the future, is really quite difficult to deal with. And since I do elections, and it's been the core of my career, though I've done a number of other things on the way, I regularly fail to heed my own warning to keep my mouth shut and get tempted to predict election results. Almost always incorrectly. So the combination of mathematical skills, numerical skills anyway, perhaps that's too strong to call it a real mathematical skill, and social and historical awareness of society are not perfect in giving one the skills to predict. I think you have a handout with some numbers on. One of the great things about numbers is that it gives you so much to build on. Now, what you can see here is a number of things. What I've outlined here are recent election results in the United States, and what I've also outlined is elections that are coming up, the kinds of balance of choices that are available in elections that are coming up. And as you can see, presidential level, Democrats won, as you know, in 2012, Obama's second victory. He won also in 2008. And 2016, we'll see the next election. We'll come on to that in a second. At Senate, the Democrats had control in the early part of this period that's covered by this little handout, and have lost it. Indeed, in 2012, they increased their status in Senate against the odds, actually. It was felt that at the time they would be likely to lose seats. They didn't, because the Republicans ran such a poor campaign, effectively, and because they nominated one or two real nutcases, who managed, in talking about particularly such issues as rape and abortion, to offend so many of their electorate as to basically drop themselves out of the race. And in a situation where there are only 33 races going on, since, as you know, 1/3 of Senate is elected each time, for 2 or 3 candidates to perform very poorly is going to make a huge difference, potentially huge difference to the outcome. But 2014 comes along, and the Republicans take control of Senate very firmly, possibly do a little bit better than they were expecting. That was about what was predicted. 2016, another race comes up. We'll talk about that in a minute. In the House is quite interesting. Democrats have had an historical strength in the House for almost a century. I don't think they've controlled it that whole time, but they've had real strength there. And what you found in recent years is that the Republicans have overcome that Democratic advantage, in spite of the fact that nationally more members of the electorate still identify themselves as Democratic-leaning voters than Republicans, and in spite of the fact that Democrats get in the aggregate vote for Democratic candidates at the House level is higher than it is for Republicans. The distribution of seats, constituency boundaries, things that we're used to discussing in the UK as well, is such that, currently at least, the Republicans have a kind of institutionalised advantage in the House, which they have parlayed very successfully into control of the House. But one of the things that the second half of the page there, I've gone into state level politics because it's very significant what's been happening at the state level. The Republicans have been doing increasingly well at state level. They've been taking massive numbers of state legislative seats. They've been taking governorships. They've been taking chambers of each house. And there's a number of statistics there. You can see that the number of governorships, they hold 31 of the 50 governorships currently. But also, there are many states in which the Republicans hold usually both chambers of the state legislature. Nebraska's different because it's got a unicameral, but nonetheless, where they control all chambers of the state legislature and the governor. 24 states in which they do that, and in 10 of those states they hold a 2/3 majority in both chambers and the governor. They're absolutely impregnable and do whatever they want in those states. Change the constitution, all kinds of stuff, if they want to. They may not. And you can see these statistics give a sense of that imbalance of power at the state level that currently exists. The success of the Republicans in attracting votes at the state level. And this is important for all kinds of reasons. One reason it's important is because most domestic politics, most domestic policy in the US is decided at state level. The majority of education spending is made at state levels, not by the national government. National government might have a department for education, but the states spend 70-80% of the money and decide how to do it in education. Road building, all kinds of things. It's state and sometimes devolved by the state to local communities. It's they that make decisions. So when it comes to the way you live from day to day, it may well be more important to you who is the governor who controls the state legislature than it is who's in the White House. No, after all, they do foreign policy, for that fact. doesn't necessarily affect you if you're in Kansas, or indeed even if you are on the East Coast or the West Coast and nearer those foreign lands. The domestic things are nonetheless critically important to your day-to-day life, and so that's one reason why the considerable success of the Republicans at this level is very important. But there's another reason, and the other reason is that every 10 years the United States holds a census, much as we do, only in the United States it's written into the Constitution that they have to write a census every 10 years. Why is it written into the Constitution? Because it's part of the electoral process. And in establishing this new nation, they realised that they would need to know how many people were where in order to start distributing reasonably fairly the constituencies around the country. And so the census is held in 2010, 2020, so on and so forth, and then the constituencies are, those constituencies that have become uneven, if you like, are redrawn before the next election. So between 2020 and 2022, the adjustments should have been made. The adjustments themselves of constituency boundaries, the statistics that just come out of the census, they fall out and it says, right, this state should have this many constituencies, that state should have that many constituencies, so on and so forth. But the actual drawing of boundaries is delegated to the states. It's a state-level responsibility. And in the majority of American states, certainly over 40 of the 50 states, this is very much a political activity. There are about 7 states that have supposedly non-partisan commissions that design their constituencies, but the others, it is a responsibility of state government, usually some combination of the governor and the state senate or some other relationship with the state legislature. And this means that those in power at the state level can draw the boundaries. Now, the term gerrymander, which we know in the UK as well, is an American invention. It's named for a man called Elbridge Gerry, so I suppose it ought to really be Gerrymander, who drew a particular constituency in Massachusetts that went up the coast that, according to a cartoonist named Thomas Nast, looked like a salamander, and he drew it that way in order to capture enough votes to win this for his party. And this is what is still going on. So you have the potential for those who are successful at state level politics being able to regenerate and confirm their success into the future by gerrymandering constituencies. And it goes on. Both parties do it, but at the moment the Republicans are just in a much better position to do it, as you can see from here. There are other things that are going on to help the Republicans in this situation. There's what's called the Big Sort. There's this book in 2008 came out called The Big Sort, which is about the way population movement's gone. People tend to move towards people who they know and like and feel comfortable with. Now, we kind of recognise this when we discuss immigration, because we say, people from this village in Italy or Romania or whatever come over and they have a good time and they write back home and their relatives come and you tend to get communities of this. Well, that's true, but it's equally true of affluent middle-class people who want to live together and have theatres together close by and so on and so forth. I remember when I taught at the University of Manchester and moved from Bury, Lancashire, which was a commute to Manchester and was beautiful and right in the foothills of the Pennines and gorgeous. And I moved to South Manchester, which was an equal commute, but my professor said to me, he said, into the professional ghetto. And this is exactly what was happening. It's where we discovered our friends lived, even if we liked the outdoors and the foothills of the Pennines, and it's where we discovered the culture that we wanted was. And this has happened on a huge scale in the United States, and in particular what it's meant is that very large communities of democratic voters have moved together into urban areas. And what it means, therefore, is they win those seats. Terrific. They win those seats easily. But they're wasting lots of votes because they're winning by huge majorities at the same time as leaving, slightly more modest majorities of Republicans in particularly in suburban areas, but also to some extent in rural areas, which is one of the reasons, only one of the reasons, a whole matrix of reasons, one of the reasons why the Republicans can, at the moment, these are all historical shifts, doesn't mean they're permanent, but at the moment, it means the Republicans have this institutional advantage that gives them easier access to winnable seats in the House, even though they've got fewer national aggregate votes to do it. So they're in a really good position at that level. There has been, I hope have come across it, quite a lot of talk recently, and certainly after the 2008 election, after the 2012 election, that the Republicans might be losing touch with the national electorate because they were because of the substantial swing of minority votes other than African American votes to the Democratic Party. Democratic Party's always held, or certainly has since the early part of the last century, has held the majority of African American votes, and it still does. That hasn't moved, 90% plus in every election. You look back at 2000, and for instance, the Latino vote, often referred to as Hispanic vote, but we should refer to it as Latino vote, was about 50-50 Democrat-Republican. At the last election, it was 70-30 Democrat-Republican. Furthermore, in 2000, that Latino vote was about 2% of the whole voting electorate. So it meant 1% of the voting electorate for each side. Whereas in 2012, it was 7% of the whole electorate. 10% of the whole electorate, so that the 10%, so that the Democrats, having got 1% of the electorate because of their Hispanic standing in 2000, were getting about 7% in 2012. Now, in close elections, that is a huge, huge advantage. And there has been a sense written up for years by authors like Roy Teixeira, John White, that this demographic shift is going to push the electorate increasingly towards the Democrats because of their advantage in these growing populations. And they are growing populations. They are second and third generation populations, sometimes first generation migrants. The migrants who moved in and their children are entering the electorate at the same time, so it's a huge bonus as the parents become citizens and become active, and the children become 18. They were born in America, so they are already citizens, and so it can have a big impact. Also, Southeast Asian voters in the US are proving a larger and more active group of, still quite a small minority, but nonetheless larger and more active than was felt, and their influence is great. So there was a sense that this would make things more difficult for the Republicans in the long run. It's difficult to tell, though, as I said. Tying these statistics and tying social reality together and tying prediction is kind of a hard game. There is a matrix of things going on. Because at the same time, these Latino communities, some of them are quite socially conservative. They come from a strongly Roman Catholic background, and some of the issues that are keenly felt by other factions of the Democratic Party are a bit worrying to them. So that could be a way in which you could split them. Some Republicans at least are aware of the issue and reach out better than others. This is a problem for the Republican Party. On the one hand, it comes across as anti-immigrant and problematic. On the other hand, there are parts of the party that do reach out. Jeb Bush, potential presidential candidate next time, is fluent speaker of Spanish. His wife is Mexican. His children, therefore, are from this diverse community. They're part of the Latino future, and there's no way they're Democrats. So there's a real mix of things going on there at the moment, and to predict strongly that this is absolutely a Democratic advantage in the long term is kind of difficult. It might be, but not all Latino families are what you might typically expect if you think of a Latino family. The Bushes are a Latino family. I know another Latino family very well because it's my family. My daughter-in-law is Brazilian, an American citizen, Brazilian born. My grandchildren are therefore part of America's Latino population. The kinds of influence that will bear on them might in part be their Latino past. If they ever think of that, I've honestly got no idea. They both own land in Brazil that their other granddads given to them. So they might think that way. But I don't know. Sam, the 10-year-old, he's 10 years old, he's just cheeky enough. And he shows very strong free enterprise, capitalist activities, and mainly plays video games where he kills people. And he loves his little brother, Benji, who is 2.5. But who's slightly disabled. He has he was born with one ear missing, and his sight isn't brilliant either. Their experience of life is going to be very different. They're probably not very typical Latinos in another way, in that they are in a family where their parents have between them 5 master's degrees and 3 PhDs. Now, no pressure there on the kids. So, taking them forward another 40 years, it may well be that by 2052, America will be perfectly placed to elect as president a part Brazilian, part Brit, slightly disabled guy as president. I hope so. Benjamin Lopez Davies. It would be pretty good. But which party for? I've got no idea at the moment. There are other issues involved in these elections, of course. The problems, elections have impact not just on the presidency, on the Congress, but also on things like the Supreme Court. Supreme Court's a critical issue. I won't go into details, but the Supreme Court is absolutely critical in contemporary politics. This morning, the Assembly, the Voting Rights Act was mentioned, and indeed, it's 50 years ago since a fabulous piece of legislation was passed, and 2 years ago since the Supreme Court disemboweled it. So the importance of something like the Supreme Court and in elections is critically important. And I think I would just turn over the page. What you will see there is what I've done is looked at 2 periods of elections, and I've just listed very simply Republican, Democrat. And what you see down this left side, pretty much the whole of the first half of the 20th century, American government was controlled by one party or the other, and there'd be a period of maybe 4 years where things were mixed up, and then it'd be controlled by the other party. It was consistent kind of politics. And then from 1968 onwards, that stops happening. And it's the period on the left is really typical of the whole of American history. It's modified a bit, but it's typical. 1968 onwards, the generation, or if you like, a couple of generations, quite a long time since 1968, since then, 50 years since then, has been unlike any other period in American history in the mixing of authority at presidential and congressional. The other thing I would say is that change, even that, is the first half and the second half is different. In the first half, you tend to get fairly consistent presidency opposed by some part of the other legislature. And what developed in that period was a system of cooperation that belied the difference in political parties, because there was some consistency in what was going on. What's happened since 1992 is the balance of power has changed almost every election. Not quite, but almost every election. And the opportunity for that kind of consistency of relationships to develop has fallen away. And relationships in national politics between the parties, it seems to me, has become much more bitter than in the previous period. The final point I'd make is actually a point that was made in yesterday's New York Times. So you can find it on the internet. There was an article in yesterday's New York Times. If I can find it, where are we? Yes, about the beginning of the Republican race, and the fact that what it's pointing to effectively is the influence, the growing influence of concentrated money in US elections. Money's always been important in US elections. Foolish to say that it hasn't been. It's been important for both parties. Democrats are very good at raising it. Republicans are very good at raising it. They each blame the other for increasing the amounts. You know, the Democrats blame the Republicans for being the party of money. Obama has been the most successful fundraiser ever in American politics. Absolutely superb. So, you know, it's one that's it's not in a sense a partisan issue, but what has changed, again, the Supreme Court has changed the landscape mainly in a case called Citizens United. There have been other cases with it. It has allowed the reintroduction, which had really been kind of banned in American elections since 1974-76 amendments to the Federal Election Campaigns Act. It's allowed back into American politics huge amounts of money from single donors, which even do not have to be necessarily identified, so that the campaign for money has become a much more concentrated on super funders rather than on lots and lots of modest funders of elections. American elections will never be cheap, but there are different ways of funding them, and there has been a structural difference which may have impact in the next few years on the way they run and on the results. Certainly, again, if we want to get into details, has had an influence on the state results that I've been talking about. So these are the kinds of influences on the party balance in Washington, on elections. 2016, presidential election coming up. Until recently, people have been saying, oh, it's Hillary's to lose. But actually, there are things that are difficult. As I say, the Republicans have been doing very well. So not necessarily, don't count them out. The elections are different at national and local level, but nonetheless, they've got a very good basis. You've got all those states, you've got a good basis to run from. Americans don't, or at least in recent years, again, looking down that list, how often have they stuck to the same party for more than 2 elections in recent years at once? Reagan, Bush. Other than that, you see 2 terms and out. Let's try somebody else. So that counts against the Democrats. Mrs. Clinton may be not that thrilled by the way Obama is setting the agenda that she is going to have to run into. On the other hand, the Republicans have got their problems. They have a substantial stable of potential candidates. But I'm not sure whether many of their candidates are stable. But they got good appeal there. So there's real competition at that level. At the other level, Senate. Well, the Republicans have done well to take it. They really want to hold on to it. But again, as you know, a third is up every 2 years, so it doesn't necessarily, it's not the same election every time. And what you've got in the next election is 24 of the 34 seats that are up are held by Republicans. So they present a very large target. Now, those seats are pretty solid. I went through them one by one, and I only really found about 4, I thought, that were really good targets for the Democrats. But nonetheless, you know, if Republican fortunes founder a bit, then, you know, that's the point at which you can lose quite a few seats. So the Democrats have got a really good chance of taking back the Senate. In the House, the Democrats haven't got a chance of taking the House. I don't think so, anyway. But again, they could make their position better. So I would say a brutal fight, and I would say a brutal fight that's going to continue for some considerable years, because things are going to remain tight. What I'm going to do is I'm going to stop with several of those issues, which we'll come back to if you wish. But what I'm going to do is stop there, because I've overstayed my welcome already. If Claudine and Dennis, if you'd like to slide your seats out, so sorry. What we're going to do is give Claudine and Dennis the opportunity to say a few words if they wish, and then go to you, so that you can drive the rest of the discussion.
Ladies before gentlemen? All right then. I'll just give a few brief comments so that we can hear from all of you. I'd like to share with you that when I was in school, I was a language major. I had no interest in politics, government, or history whatsoever. So just so you have an idea. And coming from a family where, unfortunately, my father did not have the opportunity to go to college, but yet he always said to me, if you're going to do anything, do it big. So I went from being a housewife, an environmental activist, straight into Congress. Studies have shown that men typically make decisions about entering politics based on their family's involvement in politics. Their father was involved, their brothers, whatever. Women, on the other hand, research has shown, require being asked or urged to run 3 times before they say yes. So trying to get women to run for public office is a bit more challenging. The other thing I want to share with you is that I make a distinction between politics and government. And when people would say to me, well, we'd like to introduce this politician, I'm really offended, because I do not consider myself a politician. I consider myself a public servant. And that's what I learned was the purpose of running for public office, and that was to serve the public, not to play party politics. So much of what Dr. Davies shared with us today is an education for me, but I had also realized that studying that the distinction between government and politics is that in government, you're learning how to be a change agent. You're learning how to implement policies. Whereas in politics, I've always compared it more to a chess game, like who's on first, who's needs to move their queen or their king into a certain position. And some people have referred to politics as a horse race. People put their money on who they think is going to win. And if you place or show, as in a horse race, people don't want to donate campaign money for that purpose. So my experience is I ran for Congress the first time, and the ratio of Democrats to Republicans was 15 Democrats to every one Republican. And I was a registered Republican. And the media said, there's no way in the world you're going to win because, number one, you have no name recognition, which is a key ingredient to running for public office. You have no money, which was true. You are a woman. And finally, you're a Republican. So with a ratio of 15 to 1, there's no chance you could win. Well, nonetheless, I'm a strategist. And I figured out how to get from here to there. And I got 48% of the vote. But we had a massive grassroots organization. And we appealed to people's logic. And when they said to me, well, you know, I don't know about voting for you, I'd say, well, look, give me a chance. Because in 2 years, if you don't like the job I'm doing, you can throw me out. And that was evidently enough. And the second time I ran for Congress, I was elected. And each year with larger margins. So the experience of being in Congress, governing, was one of the best experiences of my life. It was possible to get things done because we worked in a bipartisan, cooperative way. And at the time, as Professor Davies had pointed out, 1968 was when things changed. And I like to think of Dennis and myself as some of the revolutionaries. Because when I was your age, or we were your age, we always had this slogan of question authority. And we also had this saying of never trust anyone over 30. So our attitude was, we're going to be the people who change the world. And whether for good or for bad, I still feel that way. I'm all about changing the way the world is, to making it more peaceful, to make it more environmentally healthy, and to making it more equitable. So that's a little bit of my insight on my experience.
Thanks, Claudine. My name is Dennis Hertel, a Democrat from Detroit, elected at the same time, the same year in 1980 as Claudine. But she was talking about, you know, our generation. I'm going to take you back to when I was born in 1948 after World War II. And, you know, this baby boom generation. And so when I was a child, I learned a few things. The first thing that I learned was what a recession was. And because my immigrant grandparents had started a neighborhood bar that my uncle and my dad ran and worked in for years. My dad didn't go to college until he was 52 and became a teacher in Detroit. But, you know, as a kid, we lived across the street. And, you know, when there was a recession, when the economy was bad, and in the automotive industry in Detroit, we were the first ones hit by a recession. Thank goodness we're the first ones to come out when people started buying cars again. But I learned that people spent less money because they had less money. And so they would come and they would order less at the neighborhood bar, and they would sit there longer because they weren't working as much, or maybe not at all. They were unemployed. We had a lot of auto workers, people that made tires and parts and the actual manufacture of the cars. My grandfather, until he bought the neighborhood bar after Prohibition, was he did upholstery for the Packard Motor Company. So in Detroit, you know, almost everybody was related to the automotive industry, or if they were a barber or a doctor or whatever else, their patients were and customers were automotive people. So I also learned as a kid that there was something called automation that was coming. And so that all these people who worked in the automotive industry, but in all industries, that there'd be less jobs in the future. You know, so now we've seen it develop into computers and robotics, but as a little kid I knew they called it automation, that this would be happening. People would be displaced by machines. So it used to be that there were 200 people who did the paint for the automotive General Motors plant. And, now it's down to 14 people. We've got a new state-of-the-art plant, brand new, in Lake Orion, Michigan. And, just 14 people for all of the automobiles coming through, the thousands a day. Push a few buttons and, the painting's done. And they tell me that in the future, won't be a generation, within just a few years, instead of 14 people, there'll be 2 or 3 that'll be doing all this. And eventually there won't be any people at all. Okay. But as a kid, I understood this. And what I haven't understood the rest of my life is, even being involved in government, for half of it, is why didn't anybody do anything about the obvious change that was taking place? So, when we look at these numbers here about elections, the last time, the professor's right, now we see the shifting back and forth. You see the division between divided government more in the last 50 years. You see that it goes back and forth between Democrats and Republicans every 2 years, every 4 years. Why is that? Well, the same thing happened when I was just a little kid. After World War II, when I was born, because of the dislocations in the economy that were massive in our country and your country, we had people coming back from the war. Everything was war production. They'd stopped building cars. They were building airplanes and tanks. And there were shortages. And we had women in the workforce then. Thank goodness we do now. But we had women in the workforce because men were fighting. Men were displaced also. And we had this massive problem in our economy. We had a housing shortage. We had a shortage of every kind. And people were looking for jobs and better jobs to support their families. So here we have millions of people coming back from the war, and this is what's going on, just like overnight, from 1945 forward. Well, the economy couldn't adjust to all of that, and so in the late 40s and early 50s, we had economic problems and recessions and people out of work, and so the Republicans would promise, hey, we're going to get you jobs, elect us. Well, they would elect them to be the majority in Congress, and guess what? Things didn't change that much. So the Democrats would say, hey, elect us. We'll get you jobs. Just elect us. We've got the plan. Well, they couldn't succeed either, They didn't really have any great plan either. And so, this went back and forth, back and forth. But what's happening today is the same thing. Both parties promise they're going to have new jobs, and they've got a better plan, right? Yeah, but they don't. Nothing changes. People aren't happy. I mean, the economy under Bush survived. He did tax cuts and the rest. But then at the end, it went down massively. So Obama came in and he made promises and changes, and everything got better. And yet, it's not taking off like it was when I was young, in the 60s. And so people are looking for better jobs and better paying jobs. The middle class has had a decrease in income, not an increase. And so people then elect Republicans. Just 2 years after Obama and the Democrats had the House and the Senate and a massive landslide for president, Obama was the first Democrat since Johnson in 1964 to be elected by a majority. Clinton wasn't. Okay. Jimmy Carter wasn't. Obama was there. And he had these massive majorities in the House and the Senate. 2 years later, people said, no, we don't like what you're doing. You haven't done enough for us. And they elect the Republicans. Okay. And that's what's been going on back and forth, back and forth. And, I think the problem, frankly, is that neither party does have any new ideas or better ideas. They have the same old ideas. And I was saying last night again that the Republicans really haven't had a new idea since we came to Congress in 1980 and Ronald Reagan was elected. And what was that platform? It was new compared to the past. He said, let's increase defense spending massively. We doubled it. And that created some jobs and a whole different foreign policy. And he said, let's have a tax cut. Across the board, we'll have a tax cut, 10%. And that created a tax cut for people, especially the wealthy, because it was 10% across the board. So if you were rich, you got a lot of money, right? And if you didn't have very much money, if you were making $20,000 a year, it wasn't much of a tax cut for you. But it also increased the deficit. So we got into this deficit spending that we still have a problem with beginning of that. Democrats haven't had a new idea since 1964 when President Johnson was elected. Okay. What do they stand for? Well, they stand for jobs programs, for more spending on education, less spending on defense, more taxes across the board, but especially for the wealthy. And that hasn't changed at all since 1964. Well, neither of these programs are really working at all. Neither reduce the deficit, neither create new jobs. So, maybe we could talk about, what should be done. The third thing I learned as a young person was, when I was in the 7th grade, my parents were not involved in school. We were involved in, my dad was in Kiwanis, and even internationally a bit for community assistance, and they were involved in school activities, and we were involved in Boy Scouts and baseball, like kids are. I had 2 brothers. I was the middle one. And so in the 7th grade, I was assigned, I raised my hand actually, to take the part of John Kennedy in a debate. And so I started, more intensely following that campaign in 1960. And when he kicked off his campaign, he'd already been nominated, but when he kicked off his campaign, he came to Detroit and started it, which was traditional for Democratic candidates to do because of our labor movement. And so I asked, I was going to go to that campaign rally, but it rained, so I asked my mother to drive me there because I couldn't ride my bike in the rain. And she said, sure, but my mother had to stop at the store and then stop someplace else for an errand, and we were late. So I was all frustrated, and we're going to this shopping center to see President Kennedy, and I saw this crowd out in front, so I pulled over, I had my mother pull over, I asked the police officer, what was going on, and he said, well, they've already left and the motorcade's coming down here. There was a huge crowd of people, about 60, 70 people, out in the rain, and I got out, and sure enough, within 10 minutes, the presidential motorcade came up with the police and the motorcycles and everything, and this crowd surged out in the street. They were already waiting, but the crowd surged out in front of the motorcycles to stop the motorcade. And President Kennedy got up with our long-term governor, Williams, and the top was down in the rain, and he gave us a short speech about how we're supposed to all get involved. Because it's our government, we have a democracy, and we're responsible. We can't blame somebody else for what we don't like, and we should get involved. And I swarmed up there through the crowd, touched his hand, and then after that, I started working his campaign, because I found out I could ride my bike to his campaign office just a mile away, and I could do everything that was needed in the campaign, with stuffing envelopes and going door to door and dropping off the material and answering questions on the phone when people called up. And I found out I could do everything at 12 years old that the adults could do, except vote. And then I found out, in the course of the campaign over the next 2 months, that because I was concentrating on the campaign and paying attention, I knew more than the adults who were voting, in the election, because they were busy with other stuff. They were raising families and they had jobs, and they didn't have time to read the newspaper and watch this stuff on television, and they didn't really like politics anyway. And then I found out that only half the people voted in America back then. That was the high water mark, is 50% of the people that are registered to vote, and that's still true today, and it's even lower numbers. So that was a valuable lesson that now both political parties, with all the money that they're raising and spending, have relearned that going door to door and having people work in a campaign really isn't just as important as it was 50 years ago or 100 years ago, and so they're relearning that. And I think the difference is, and what's needed today, is that they haven't advanced beyond the basics and really try to create and be imaginative about what should be done to improve employment, to improve the economy for the United States. So anyway, we're really happy to be here with you. Lovely weather. We thank you very much. It's a very hard winter back in the United States, so we're really glad to be with you and meet all of you and take your questions.
Right, ladies and gents, questions please. It's your turn.
Picking up on what you were talking about before, redistricting.
Yeah.
Now, if you look at the way in which redistricting, and one of the things which actually contributed to an over-representation of Republicans in the House,
Yeah.
are people beginning to notice, and what can we do about it?
People are noticing about redistricting, and in some places there have been changes. For instance, in California, 4 or 6 years ago, I can't quite remember when, there was a ballot initiative, because they can change law by ballot initiative in California, to stop the political drawing of constituency boundaries and to create one of these commissions. And it's quite interesting because what's happened in California is the Democrats have gained quite a lot from that. But the Democrats were actually in charge before, and yet they didn't move from the political to the bipartisan because it was kind of easier to trade with the Republicans and maintain a small majority in the state legislature. We'll have this one if you'll have that one, it keeps us majority, than it was to try to move on. And it's not until the ballot initiative got involved to change it. There are a couple of other states where it's being considered, but mostly it's not. And if it is one of those situations where, you know, unless you change the rules, then the lay of the playing field is always going to be against you. And one has certainly seen clear examples where one party or the other, and in recent years it has been the Republican Party because they've been successful, having taken control of the state, can redraw its constituencies terrifically to its advantage. In North Carolina, the Democrats, even at the last election, gained more votes than the Republicans. But if I remember rightly, the Republicans took 8 seats and the Democrats took 5. You know, a considerable imbalance of seats. I say part of that is because of, you know, just population shifts that are entirely to do with the population, but part of it is by skillful drawing of boundaries. And,
yeah. I don't think it's ever going to change. You know, go back to the founding of our country. First thing is, you know, we formed the Senate as a great compromise of Connecticut. Yeah, because people couldn't come together as a country because Virginia was huge, Pennsylvania was huge, New York, and Delaware, Rhode Island, these states were tiny. How could they form a union? And they said, well, again, we have 13 separate colonies, or, you know, so they made this great compromise, which the people on the right wing keep, you know, referring today to the founding fathers, but they forget, because they don't like the word compromise, and the Speaker of the House, a Republican, said we can never talk about compromise. We're not going to compromise anybody. Maybe we can reach common ground is his term. They forget totally that their country is founded on compromise, because how can you have a diverse nation if you don't have that? And how can we have a republic if the states hadn't agreed on that? But then that brings you to the second question. How are you going to do the House of Representatives? That's the other part of the compromise, population. So they agreed, and that's why we have the census created, you know. I'm here because, well, one of the reasons I'm here, I've been on a Congress all this time, is because of that. In Michigan, for 150 years, we kept adding seats. You know, 435 was decided by statute as a cap, because before that they just kept adding seats as the country grew and the states were added, and on and on and on. And so Michigan then lost population because of this economy, you know, we were talking about. In 1980, we lost a seat. Well, I survived that as a freshman. They said it's going to be you, but one of our guys ran for governor, and they worked it out. 10 years later, I had a brother in the state Senate, a brother in the state House. I've been taking care of all the legislators for their visits to Washington and contributing to their campaigns to make sure that in reapportionment this time, knowing we'd lose more population, that I'd be all set. Except by 1990, we lost 2 seats in Michigan. So now for 150 years they hadn't lost any seats, they kept adding seats, and now we're facing 2. So the Republican governor said, hey, I see an advantage if we don't work out a compromise and go to court. I think I'll do well. And even though we lost, you know, 6 out of the 18, by the time the court drew the lines, because we couldn't agree on the legislature and the governor reaching a new map, yeah, the Republican gained 4 Republican seats in the Michigan delegation. And it's purely political in that regard. The professor's totally right. You know, every time, in a few states, you know, have these different commissions, and they do work well. But in Michigan, I can tell you, and when you go over the list of the states that have these overwhelming Republican majorities now, they're not going to set up a new plan that's fair or different or more equal. They're going to say, we've got the majority, we're going to draw the lines and decide, you know, who the congressmen are. And that's not going to change at all. And the only way you could change it is through a constitutional amendment, frankly, which will never pass, which is a very, very difficult process.
I'd like to have some more student questions. Or some. Yeah.
I was going to ask if the deficit is a big issue coming into the next election, because obviously it's $7 trillion, and like if that's one of the key points of the next election.
The deficit is always an issue, but probably not as important as it had been during the Reagan years. The reason being is that people are more interested in a variety of other issues like immigration, like healthcare, like education. So I think it's in the back of many people's minds, but not a huge issue.
The deficit has been, was a major issue, 4 years ago, when Republicans took over. And that's how the Tea Party started, because of the deficit, And they were talking about how incredible it was and all the rest, Now it's been reduced by over a third. It's almost half reduction of the deficit. And guess what? Nobody ever talks about it. Nobody even knows it's been reduced by that much, but nobody talks about it as an issue anymore. So, yeah, the deficit continues, but I don't think it'll be dominant, because the deficit goes down when the economy gets better. So now the projections are that the economy, as the last 4 quarters and into this next year is projected to get better. Employment getting better. That means less people on welfare. That means more people paying taxes. It's simple mathematics equation. And so, the last time we had a balanced budget was in the year 2000. And that lasted just, about this long. And so the deficit will always be with us, I think. It's just a matter of what level.
Yes.
Do you think Obama's reputation will affect Hillary's campaign if she does run for president, or whoever runs for the Democrats?
Well, I think it will affect Hillary, because she was Secretary of State in his administration, so she's clearly tied. But also, it always affects whoever is the nominee from their party. Looking back at the record they have to defend, it's hard for somebody from the same party to say, "Oh, I'd change everything," and I disagree with them. There are a few people that can do that, but maybe Bernie Sanders, who's going to run, but of course Bernie won't really, is the independent, and he's actually a socialist, and I know him and I like him a lot, but I don't think he'd ever himself think he's going to win. It's just to raise issues, and he would never be able to raise big amounts of money. I mean, corporations and rich people are not going to give the socialist Bernie Sanders, a lot of money to run for president. So I think that, Hillary will have to defend the record. She can say where she differs, and I think she's already looking for some places now, but that'll be more difficult for her.
I also think she's going to have to defend her husband's record, and that could be an issue. But at the same time, if Jeb Bush runs, people are going to think more about his brother than they will about his father. And to my way of thinking, that's a good thing. The man who got us into 2 wars and, caused a whole lot of other chaos. So.
Yes.
I was just wondering, how damaging do you think the effect of money in politics is to the American democracy? Like, how damaging the Koch brothers and how much
Horrible. Horrible. I don't think there's anything worse about American politics than the Supreme Court decision called Citizens United. I mean, that mere title offends me, because the reality is it is dividing citizens between the rich and the poor. And I was telling Dennis, I got an email just last night about a group of former members of Congress who are pulling together with some members of the corporate world and the foundation world to do something about this Supreme Court decision. And I remember one of the Supreme Court justices who not too long ago retired, when he was asked, well, what was the worst decision that had been made during your tenure? He said it was the Citizens United decision. I will say, as a citizen, I just find it so offensive that the Koch brothers and others can pour so much money, which then is translated into television ads that one cannot bear to turn on the television set for months in advance, because you are exposed to half-truths and I think scandalous messages. And so I find this whole issue of more money going into political campaigns particularly outrageous because, then again, one has to excuse my background, but when I first ran for office and didn't have pots of money, but I had the citizens. I mean, I had a young woman who made T-shirts, silk-screened T-shirts and vests for the men, and they went out and we did a grassroots campaign. We were told that you cannot go into the senior citizen housing units unless you cater them, and we didn't have any money to cater coffee and tea and biscuits and everything for the senior citizens. So we had our volunteers bake cookies, and we had donations of coffee and tea, and I mean, we were able to run a campaign on a shoestring, and to me, it brought us closer to the people. Now what's happening is you only see an image, and sometimes you don't even see an image of the candidate, but you hear negative messages about the opponent. So I think it is very destructive. So those of you who have a pen in hand, let me suggest that you mark down this website, because when I left Congress, I was so offended that the civic education was so poor. A number of us got together and we formed a website called votesmart.org. And initially, we only looked at three things. We looked at who was giving the money to a particular candidate. We looked at their biography, you know, what had they done in the past. And the third thing we looked at was how were they ranked by a variety of different organizations, such as the Chamber of Commerce, the labor unions, the women's organizations, the environmental organizations, etc. Now, there's a whole lot more information on that website because we started off just doing Congress, the House and the Senate, and oftentimes candidates refuse to answer the quiz that we give them. So we have college students do the background research to enter the data into the website so that voters can be better informed about the people they're selecting.
On campaign finance, one good source, if you want, source of information, is the Federal Elections Commission, which keeps all that data at fec.gov. But there's another site which uses that information and breaks it into a more accessible and format, which is called Open Secrets. Open Secrets is a great site on campaign finance. One of the things that Citizens United is supposed to have done, it's actually a simplistic interpretation of the case, but nonetheless, what people see it as having done is having given corporations the status of citizenship, that they are seen as people, as citizens. So one of our former congressional visitors, John Tanner, was deeply offended by this idea, and said that I'll believe a corporation is a citizen when one of my Texan friends takes it out and executes it. One slightly arcane point I'd like to make back on the redistricting thing. As I said, the districting is very much done by states. We've talked about turnout. Turnout at presidential elections in recent years has tended to be around 62%, I found, but around 62%. Turnout at midterm elections is a lot lower than that, usually around 40%. At the last midterm election, second midterm of an incumbent presidency tends to do really badly. The second midterm of the second term of an incumbent presidency tends to be bad. The turnout was 36.6%. And it's also a different electorate. It'd be the same if it was a random selection of the earlier one, but it's not. So there's a much lower proportion of African American voters turn out for Obama, but why turn out for their white middle class, member of Congress? And anyway, they're busy that day. The turnout of other minority groups is down. The turnout of the proportion of older people and church-going people in midterm elections as part of the electorate goes up substantially, and they tend to be not just Republican voters but conservative Republican voters. So it's a different electorate, and it's in those midterm elections that about 75% of governorships are elected. So the people who are deciding or helping to decide the distribution of constituencies are really drawn from a very different, or elected by a very different electorate to the one that turns out in presidential years. And it just seems to be having a more considerable effect than it used to have. Partly because of changes in state government and the way governors are elected and the terms of governors. I won't get into that kind of detail. It's the kind of nerdish stuff that I love. But I won't impose it on you. Thank you very much. I think that's we should draw this session to a close, and I think there's a brief break before the next session. Thank you.